Welcome to One Broken Mom, a podcast dedicated to raising awareness of mental health, parenting, and self-improvement. I am the host, Ameé Coney. One Broken Mom is not a family show. It is meant for adults and contains sometimes adult language. The topics I cover can be serious and unsettling to people. However, I do have a sense of humor laced with a little bit of a punk rock attitude. So if you're interested in real talks about real stuff by real people so that we can all get better together, well, then you're in the right place, and so welcome. Okay, so welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode. We're going to talk about a topic that is probably one of the, I would say, most tabooist topics today and throughout human history, recorded history, and that is the topic of incest. In fact, the word itself is derived from a Latin word that means impure or unchaste. And while historic records have shown that incestual relationships have been a way for families for generations to continue lineage and to hold on to assets that they have, such as power, land, and money, there's always been this universal regard that the sexual relationships between parents and children is forbidden. A fear of inbreeding, which can happen from close biological relatives procreating with each other, is a part of that reason. But the truth here is that incest is predominantly an adult taking sexual advantage of a child, and that is flat out abuse. The psychological impacts of this particular form of abuse are devastating. When a child is conflicted with trying to understand what their relationship is with an older sibling or a parent, and then also engaging in sexual acts before their own brains and bodies are ready for it, personally, I can't even imagine what that world would be like for someone. And so today I have actually with me Nancy Allen, and she is a father-daughter incest survivor and the founder of an organization called Tale of the Bell, an organization that offers coaching and resources to other incest survivors. So welcome to the show today, Nancy.
Thank you very much for having me.
So to be honest, I don't even know how you start off, a conversation like this. It's so we talk about it being taboo, but it's also the struggle of, wow. So, what I just want to ask you directly is, tell me about how your dad sexually abused you. I mean, does that work? Is that how we get this going?
Sure. So, I can give you a little bit about my background and how it all started. So, I was raised in a large Italian family, and middle class. My father was a podiatrist. My mother was a nurse practitioner. So, incest can happen anywhere, at any demographic. So, just keep that in mind as we talk. But I had always been in a strict environment, but as I grew up into my teen years, it became something that turned sexual. So my father started turning to me as he was one of the first quadruple bypasses done in this Mass General in Massachusetts. Oh, wow. And he was home recuperating. And I was, at the time I was about 12, 13 years old. And my mother was working a 3 to 11 shift as a nurse. And I was basically his caregiver. And he turned to me as a husband would turn to a wife in that way, although it's not really what it all is about. It's about control. It's about him not being in control of his own life, in control of his own. And in a lot of ways, I really think that my father was a sociopath, and it just kind of developed from there. So for me, it started when I was really 13, and as he recuperated, it became more of an issue, and more frequent, and it progressed in terms of the actual activities that more beyond oral sex, it turned into intercourse. So, and I'm going to use terms here because I believe that we say what we mean, and I hope that's not a problem.
No. So this is an adult show, and so please be informative. This isn't about obviously kind of graphic information for the sake of just being graphic, but to be actually have a real conversation, because it is uncomfortable to talk about this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And as you're describing this, I feel like we need to start this episode off with If anybody's listening to this and this is uncomfortable and triggering for them to hear some of this stuff, please by all means stop, take a breath, because I actually do get feedback from some of my listeners that sometimes they can't listen to one whole episode at once. They have to stop, kind of reflect on it. So, can we start this off with, what do you advise an incest survivor right now that may be listening to this, that is starting to feel, a little bit of anxiety building up? What's your recommendation for them as they continue with us on our conversation today?
I think this is a self-care. Listen to your feelings, listen to your body, and do what you need to do. If you can't listen to this, don't listen to this.
Okay.
And if you want to do it in pieces, do it in pieces. Listen to what you're feeling and don't push yourself is what
Okay.
I would recommend.
Good. Okay. So that's out for everybody that is listening to this and feeling those levels of discomfort in there. Cause I got that sense as you're talking, like, wow, we probably should have started that off. So here we go. So yes, to answer your question, Nancy, please do not worry about how you talk about this. Talk about it the way that we all need to be talking about it.
Okay. I was about 13 years old when my father started having oral sex with me. And the first time I can remember, I used to give him back rubs because he was in bed all day recuperating. And I remember the first time that he called me into his room. And this time it was slightly different because he was naked. And I could hear my brothers and sisters playing outside. And it was just, I knew that something wasn't right. But it became one of these, I didn't have control over what I was being asked to do. And I did.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately after that, I recognized how I didn't fully recognize exactly what was happening, but I recognized that this was not right, that this was bad, and that I blamed me for it. And I did things from anything from really just vomiting, getting really sick, to at one point somewhere in here he would ejaculate, and he ejaculated into my hair, and it was kind of the things that I could never get it clean, and I ended up cutting my hair, just literally taking a pair of scissors and cutting my hair kind of thing. So there's that kind of, as a child, response, because it's too hard to process exactly what is happening. It was, for the most part, something that occurred during the day while he was recuperating, and then it would happen at night. He was a podiatrist. My mother was a nurse practitioner. She would work a 3 to 11 shift, and so very frequently I was one of the first ones home from school, and he could pop in at any point in time because he had his own private practice and had kind of irregular hours. So I spent a lot of time as a teenager literally hiding in the attic, literally sitting up. There was a trap door in a closet, literally spent in a dark closet listening very intently for sounds that were coming into the house. If it was a heavy footstep, I would know that it was him. If it was light or laughter or whatever, I would know that it was my siblings. And then I would kind of come down, run around outside, and come back through the houses if I had just come home. But if it was him, I was quiet as a mouse up in that attic. Flashlight would turn off and just wait until somebody else came home.
Because he never did
And that was
anything
a way of coping for a while.
Yeah. So he never tried
very
anything while
rarely,
when people are around, right?
and later on he would. Early on, he did not.
Okay.
So that first year, it tended to be more during the day when it was he and I. And about a year of this going in, I spent a lot of time hiding. But at the same point in time, I was one of these kids that compartmentalized things very well. I was a little older, so I was not a child, tiny infant child. I wasn't in those pre-formative years. So I understood at some level, but there was a whole level of secrecy being told. If you share this or you tell somebody, they won't understand, and they will take, the split the family. It'll be your fault, that kind of thing. And so I didn't say anything to anyone. And I was I'm highly intelligent, and I was able to channel it into actually studying, because my father valued education. And if he saw me studying, he would leave me alone. So that was a piece of it. And the other piece of it was, it helped me focus. So if I was sitting up in that attic, I was actually doing complex math problems because I'm a math geek. And it would keep my mind focused. and that at the other side, I'm still on guard and still listening for what is happening around me. So I'm always on guard with what is happening around me. When around just around my 14th birthday, I had I was supposed to start working with my father back in his practice, and we would have been alone a lot in between patients, during breaks, that kind of thing. And I was terrified of what that could mean and what it might escalate to. So it wasn't a conscious thing, but my behavior started changing, and a teacher picked up on it. And the teacher reported it to the guidance counselor, who I'm like, oh my God, now what? Because if I say something, what's next? What's going to happen? And guidance counselor, I sat in a room and I wouldn't refuse to say anything. So it was a man, and so he referred us to, and went from there, and ultimately ended up being referred to a therapist. My oldest sister, while my mother was away for a week, basically asked me, while I was visiting her, she didn't live with me, asked me why was I seeing a therapist. And I wasn't, I don't know, for whatever reason, I actually told her in a note that this is what was going on with me. Next thing I know, she's with me in my next therapy session. And what came out from there was her statement to me was, oh my God, he promised me that he had stopped with me.
Oh no. Oh wow.
So it came out at that point in time that, wait a minute, I'm not special. Wait a minute, what the heck is going on? And just an overwhelming overflow of emotions and now it's completely out of control. This is 1978. It's the first year of mandatory reporting in the state of Massachusetts, where I'm from. And therapist is now meeting with my sister, and I'm no control at all. Basically, they called in social services. Of course, I was removed from the home with my two younger brother and sister, placed in emergency foster care, and then had to go to court. And basically, that day in court, I was the day that we went to court with Child Protective Services. I was with my sister while she was calling a number of different people to see if they would take us for the night, because they wouldn't allow us to stay with her because he had a key to her apartment. And nobody would take us. So I ended up in an emergency foster care for a couple of nights with my twin brother and sister. And then ended up having to go the next day, leaving my brother and sister behind at the foster home, into court. And there in court, there's my mother, my father, their attorney. On the other side, there's the Child Protective Services. My advocate, which I didn't know. My older siblings, 3 of them were in the room. And so there's probably 10 people or so in this room. And I'm being called in to stand before a judge who's sitting way up to basically tell me what my father had done to me, with my father sitting right behind me. Of course, I couldn't speak.
Of course not. Of course not. Oh my God.
Yeah. So I'm not sure that they do it that way these days, but that was as traumatizing as pretty much anything else. I remember leaving the courtroom, sitting on a bench, waiting to see what happened, this kind of thing, and my father coming out and basically apologizing to my mother and not looking at me. So here I am thinking I'm at fault. All right. So the next thing that happens is my father's pulled out of the home. I'm pulled out of the home. He's ordered into therapy. I'm ordered into therapy. So I took from that, as a 14-year-old kid, that I'm equally at fault. He was right that they were going to separate us, and that he was right that I'm at fault as he is. And that's the way things went on. I was placed with my oldest sister, who was a year older than my other sister that reported it. And I spent the summer with her, with my younger brother and sister as well. And it was a strange environment. I'm about to start high school. I'm already terrified about starting high school, just as any kid would be. But now I've got an added complexity of, am I starting it here with her? I don't even know anyone. It turned out that it didn't happen that way. We were ordered into family therapy, but strangely, the family therapy was with the therapist that I was working with had a husband, and her husband ended up working with my father. So it was just, how do you have a relationship with a therapist that, can I trust this person? Can I not? Therapy didn't last long. And I was given back to my parents in terms of physical custody within about 3 months.
Okay,
And
so your dad didn't do jail time. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I'm sitting here going, they recommended therapy, but not like
yes,
criminal prosecution.
correct. So keep in mind, my father's a doctor. He admitted it openly in court. He apologized, and they thought that he was curable. He did no other thing other than being pulled from the home like I was, and being ordered into therapy like I was. That was it. So within, I was returned to the home and to their physical custody, but the state retained custody for probably another 9 months. And within 6 months of being returned home, my father got me pregnant, and it was very public because it came out on a school field trip into Washington D.C. with an old teacher, and I was having terrible pains and was taken to the emergency room there, and that's where they basically said that I was pregnant and was likely losing the pregnancy.
Mhm.
So um, at that point in time, clearly my mother knew, clearly the whole family knew. And my mother basically, my father said it wasn't him. My father said that must have been sleeping around. He called me a fucking whore. And my mother basically let it go from there. So I never said anything again. And at one point in time in there, I remember going to a priest because I was raised Catholic. I remember confession, and there again being given my penance of whatever, however many Hail Marys, and Our Fathers or whatever. So again, it's reinforcing it's my fault. I had my grandmother, his mother, basically tell me that he's sick, just don't entice him. Again, my fault.
Your fault, yeah.
So it was reinforced in a lot of places. And so I lived with believing that it was my fault. And I just figured how to compartmentalize things. It continued actually into my early 20s. And I was married still at that point in time. And I would not have said anything simply because I had met ultimately my husband when I was 15 years old. He was the only boy I ever dated. We ended up getting married at 20. And I was terrified that he would be taken away from me if put into something else. So I dealt with compartmentalizing and I ended up putting myself through college. And but I was very, very much an overachiever because I wasn't good enough. I needed to be perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. So, so many things. First of all, I'm going to admit that, I'm speechless. I'm speechless for so many things. I'm speechless for first of all, your bravery at being able to share something as traumatic as that. I'm speechless of the way that the adults around you failed you miserably
Mm-hmm.
for so long. I'm just, I mean, it's just unbelievable to me right now. And I just, God, I'm like, I'm so angry for you. I'm so like, I want to cry for you right now. I know that you have like, you're on a journey out of all of this, but, talking about this and as frank
Mm-hmm.
as that you've done that, I mean, the only words that I have, I think are just like, holy shit, everything happened, everything went wrong. And you got left with believing that at the end of all of this, that somehow you were accountable for this and that you were to blame for this. And that is devastating. Like that's devastating that's the life that you had to continue to move on from. Now, I believe in your story, you said because of dealing with all of this, you had inpatient psychiatric help to try to like sort through this, several
Yep.
times. Duh.
So,
Of course that would be.
so, so I had gone to outpatient therapy a couple of times. I was suicidal in my late teens, and
Again, no shit, right?
um, and then again when I was in college, and I sought therapy both times, and it just wasn't helpful because it was too close and it was too. I mean, I'm under my parents' health insurance, so they know it's like there's always this fear of being pulled again, of being removed, and I'm not in control. Control is a big deal for me.
Mhm.
I need to know, ducks have to be in a row, and I need to know what's happening,
Mhm.
even now, and I'm 55 now.
Mhm.
Um, but That went on into my 20s. And I mean, there's more to this story in the sense that my father, as he knew that he was going to get away with things, he became much more a psychotic. That's the only word that I can use, is psychotic. And he used his medical knowledge against me so that he physically did not leave evidence. And I mean, he was torturing me sexually. And in a couple of instances in there, um, he gave me to some of his associates. So there's this kind of thing happening in the background as well. And that's really when I became suicidal and just didn't see a way out. I ended up going to college, and I went to college in another state, and I was very fortunate. Again, I channeling, the way I channeled was to channel it into school, into focusing, and largely because it would take my mind away from everything else. And I learned how to do that, which was a good thing for me because I became someone that the teachers kind of, is really highly ranked. And I ended up with scholarships and did the same thing through college. I did a 5-year program in 2.5 years in college, and I worked full time. I mean, I was just constantly compartmentalizing and just kind of focusing because I knew that the only way out was to be financially independent and get out.
Yep.
And that's what I ended up doing. I got married when I was just turned 21 and kind of went off from there.
Yeah.
I didn't really seek therapy after that for a while. And when I was 28, my father died. And the night of his death, he had always had a heart condition. And that night before he died, he had called me because he was going in for another quadruple bypass. And he called me and he basically said on the phone to me, "I'm sorry, can you forgive me?" And I couldn't speak to him. I literally handed the phone to my husband and I walked away. And it was one of these, how dare you? I couldn't respond at all. The next day he died. And I really spiraled. It was like the floodgates opened, and I had no idea what was happening at this point. Where previously I had been able to channel it and hold it back and kind of focus on things, I couldn't do anything. I was having nightmares, like I was having flashbacks. I was being triggered all the time, and about within 2 weeks, I was so bad. I can remember sitting on the couch where my husband had taken out our 2 young sons. They were 1 and 3 at the time. And he had taken them out because he was really the stay-at-home parent. And I'm sitting there with a bottle of pills, and I was like, I can't do this to them. I leave them because they deserve better than I had. And as a result of that, I ended up making some phone calls, and I called an emergency number. They brought me right in, and then basically I ended up in the emergency room at an acute psychiatric hospital. And I ended up staying there for about 3 weeks. And it was the first time really speaking and telling them to tell me to tell them what had truly happened. What did he do? And what was amazing here is that for the first time in my life, my mother stood up and supported me. She came up from Maryland where she was living. And so he was dead. And so this is her basically, me basically opening up to her, really calling her on the spot to why didn't you support me? Why didn't you believe me? Why weren't you there for me? And basically it came out as that she was probably abused herself, and
Right.
that she just didn't have the capacity to,
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, she and I became friends. I mean, she was never a mother in a sense, but she became a grandmother to my children. And we became friends, and she actually lived with me until she died years later. But anyway, in that process, I ended up going through probably about 2 years. I came out of the hospital, tried to go back to work, which was an amazing story in and of itself. It was the first time I ever was accepted because I had a boss who I needed support. I had a startle response. I couldn't have people coming up to me. Somebody standing in the doorway watching me I couldn't handle it. So I had a boss who basically said to me, "What do you need? And let me help you." And so we got all men in the department together and sat down together. And basically I told them in high levels what was going on. And my boss was so supportive to the point where he was basically saying, if you can't read what you need to read, then you hand it to me and I will read it and we'll go from there. Just an amazing, amazing situation. And that was the first time ever that it was like, this is okay. I was so afraid that I was to be rejected or that now it's going to interfere with my professional life and all of this. And that was the exact opposite of what happened.
Wow, that right there is an
So,
amazing thing. Like, I'm actually tearing up. I mean, honestly, about that too, for you to be able to receive that kind of warmth and support from people, about to be able to accommodate and understand, and to give you some safety, for you
yeah.
to be able to do that. It's pretty impressive and pretty incredible. So, wow. One of the questions that comes in, and I ask this because I don't want it to sound insensitive, and I don't want it to sound
Mm-hmm.
shamey, but it's kind of like the direct question that people think and wonder to themselves, but are afraid to ask. And that's not me, but you go and you out your father for the abuse that you've been suffering. Your sister stands up with you and does the same thing. And it's out there and people know about it. And yet it continues for many years after that. How does that happen? And I'm not saying, and like I said, this question is how did you not know better? How did you not get out of it? I'm not directing it at you. I just want people to understand, how does that happen? What goes on? Because I've addressed abusive situations myself, other people, where when somebody says, why did you let it go on so long? I don't know. In the moment I didn't know what was going on. In this situation, have you been able to understand, how even when it's wrong, even though it
Yeah.
feels terrible, how did it go on for
I
so many
think
more years?
so. There's a whole family dynamic happening here, right? I mean, keep in mind I have 7 brothers and sisters. So, and at that time, my grandmothers were alive. My grandfather wasn't. But so for this to happen in the first place, the family has to have turned inward anyway. So very much there's very few friends outside of the home. There's a lot of secrecy happening here. There's again, my father was a doctor and he was protected by other doctors. My mother protected him. My grandmother protected him. And basically I was told that if I said anything, that we could be financially in trouble because he would then potentially lose his practice. He would then have a reputation issue. And then as a result of all of that, he would be, then what? We would be out on the streets. We would be whatever. So don't say anything because then it will be your fault that with a family ends up in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't that it wasn't known. And even in that time period, I did tell a couple of people. I told a priest.
Mm-hmm.
I told the teacher knew, and nobody did anything. So it's consistently reinforced that it's my fault or partly my fault.
Or you have
So,
control. You have
and I had
control in
already
it.
been
Yeah.
put,
Yeah.
and that I was also pulled
Mm-hmm.
once. To me, being pulled was worse than the abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there's all those dynamics happening.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also about a lot of shame involved because I believe it's my fault. This whole thing is I'm bad. Shame is about I am not a worthy person.
Mm-hmm.
I am not lovable. So you push that to, I found a place that I was okay, and that was in school, and then later at work, and that's where I channeled.
Right. Yeah. And that is a common thing. We have talked about this on the show and again with other abuse survivors. One is the victim shaming that comes from the outside. Why would you let that go on? That's why I wanted to make sure that my question to you did not feel that's how I was asking that, because I've had that question directed at me. Like, why would you stay? Why would you go on? And then when you sit there and go, I don't know why, it only reinforces your own sense of shame that you, again, are,
Mhm.
air quotes for people that are listening, allowing it to happen, which is not the case. We're not allowing ourselves to be abused. We're being manipulated. We're being taken advantage of. We're being assaulted by somebody else. Our complicity doesn't mean we're allowing it to happen and we have some accountability. It means that there are factors beyond our control emotionally that are buttons being pushed by a skilled psychotic abuser that's, and on
Mhm.
the outside looks as if we're just letting it all happen. So that's why I
Yeah.
wanted to make sure that we got to talk about that, because that's a question a lot of people that have no idea and have no experience with, is something as severe as what you've gone through, or even just emotional abuse, which is still severe in its own nature.
Yeah.
They look around and go, I don't get it. Well, I always tell people, thank God you don't fucking get it, because when
Yeah,
you're in it,
absolutely.
yeah.
But I think the one other thing that you need to think about here is when you talk about rape or you talk about some other abuse, right? Um, they tend to be, or they can be, one-off events. They're not necessarily multiple. As an incest survivor, at least at the extreme where I am, it's a way of life.
Mhm.
It is what I know. It is my childhood. So that's like trying to say, how do you totally just trash everything from your life? How do you move and say, okay, I'm going to start over. Wait, it's hard enough to do that as an adult. How do you do that as a kid?
Mhm. Exactly. It's the grooming that goes along with it and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Okay. So there are a couple of things that I really did want to talk into, and I think that you've hit on it, because one of the things that I wanted to, understand is that this, what is this common feeling that incest survivors actually seem to share with all of the ones that you've actually worked with? And I mean, you've mentioned shame and embarrassment or guilt. I sense that
Mm-hmm.
would be it, because that's kind of common with all abuse survivors. But is there a theme that when with incest that's different from that, or is it really that's the biggest challenge?
I think there's probably three of them. I think shame is probably the biggest one because it's a sense of I'm not worthy, I'm bad, that whole thing.
Hmm.
I think the second one I would probably say is it's my fault. There's some level of, that I wouldn't call it guilt, but there is some level of fault involved here or belief in that falsehood, right?
Hmm.
And then I think the third one here is trust, right? There's this whole level of how do you trust anyone in any kind of a relationship so that you're constantly, I mean, PTSD is a big thing particularly for incest survivors. And that level of trust it never goes away. I think the other thing that people don't realize is that this is not something that you heal from.
Hmm.
This is not a get over it. This is not, no matter how much therapy you have, your life changes. I mean, you move past the recovery phase, which is, when my father died, that's what I was in, the recovery phase. But it's something that will impact you for the rest of your life. And you'll relook at it over the course of your life because your life circumstances change. So like when I had my first children, childbirth for me was, what the heck is this? Because it's triggering,
Yeah.
right? That kind of physical body response. Same thing when my children got to be the age that I was abused. Now I see it as, wait a minute, this is a 13, 14-year-old kid. My son is not going to be able to push up and really do something to me or defy me or whatever. How would I have expected myself to be able to do that? So there's a different level of understanding because you see it through that that type of thing. And
Hmm.
then again, later when my husband died, same type of thing. I was 49 years old at that point when my husband died, and again, I was brought to back to nightmares. So I think this is something that as you go through life, you experience it because it becomes something that you integrate. It is not something that you heal from.
Yeah. And we talk about, one broken mom, one of the things, like you, I'm a complete nerd. So, I don't just tackle the psychology, but really it's, what changed for me and my understanding of my whole world, my whole life and, past experiences and where my future is the study of neuroscience and
Mm-hmm.
and how brain architecture is formed. And so when you take something like what you just experienced, while your brain is learning its wiring and it's assembling, that it's going on, of course this is something you don't just get over. Unfortunately, you inherited an entire system and an operating system that was fouled up by this experience. And I imagine that we all have different levels of what that faulty wiring is, and some of it we can correct, but for the most part, which most people get to this realization is I can't change my responses, I can't change my triggers. I can work to neutralize them a little bit, I can work to not let them take over me on a day-to-day basis, and and go on autopilot. And it's a very emotionally almost fatiguing and exhausting days when what you're doing is, man, I feel like I've gotten triggered 10 times by different experiences, and all I've done is try to calm myself back down and re-regulate and do that, because before we just kind of roll on autopilot. So there is no question in my mind, or I think anybody else that's listening, to understand that this isn't a get over it. But now, we used to believe you could, right? Like, before we knew exactly how ingrained this again, brain architecture really is. It was like, well, if we just do therapy, this is something you just manage and roll. And that also lends shame, right? The fact that you can't recover from it is another form of shame, that some people think that they have, like, I can't get over this, so I must still be
what's wrong with
at
me?
fault, right? Yeah. Now, so you I wanted to ask this question also about this, because this is because it's so taboo, because it's so sensitive. It's not just like you talked about, like a rape or an assault from a stranger, or even the neighbor or whatever. This is like probably one of the deepest violations, like in nature. Like, incest doesn't really occur in other species. It's not something, there's a couple of little bugs or whatever. I did some research on this, because again, when I go in, and so this isn't an aberration. It's a genuine aberration in Mother Nature out there. And so do you have to be able to, in your opinion, in the work that you've done here, do you have to be able to admit that this happened to you, to anybody in your life, in order to be able to heal, to move forward from it? Or can you work on the healing and the integration and the adaptions that you have to take, and still keep that to yourself? Because I feel like some people will never take the first step if it involves having to tell another person about this, or feeling like they can't do this because it would require them telling their spouse or, anybody else in their life. I mean, I think that a therapist obviously might be, definite, you have to, but do you have to tell anybody else beyond that? Or do you think that people can actually still be able to move and find a life for themselves with that secret?
I think one of the things that, when a survivor takes back control, part of the control that they take back is over their own experience and their own story. So who they share with, when they share, is completely up to them at any point in time. There are different ways to heal, and a healing journey is different from person to person to person. Nobody's is the same. I think you need to get your story out. I think you need to understand what happened, and to be able to really look at it from an adult's eye perspective, not from a child's expected, right? So that there are ways to do that. I mean, you could go learn how the brain works, and learn neuroscience, and then understand that, oh, okay, maybe that's what happened, and that's why that was that. But I think that for whatever way, you need to get to an understanding of what is actually happening physically with the brain, emotionally, and to be able to see it beyond that childhood view, but from an adult lens. That then enables you to forgive yourself. And that forgiveness is what then leads you to be able to move on. Because when you stop blaming yourself, and you let go of that shame, and understand that shame is not on you, that's society's shame, that's his shame or her shame, it's not yours at all. But I think that it takes that understanding, and then that forgiveness. That understanding, for the most part, is likely going to come from therapy, because it's such an intense subject matter. Now, most people, my understanding is that about a third of survivors will disclose when they're children. Another 1/3 will disclose with a median age in their 50s. So this is something that people carry for years and years and years and years.
Wow.
And then there's another third that will never disclose.
Yeah.
So keep in mind that people carry this, and it's the worst thing in the world to have to carry, because they're not really living a fulfilling, happy life, because there's this dark secret sitting with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. And I'm glad you kind of brought in some numbers in there. Because like I said, I just, you know, fulfilling lives are what you and I both want. It's what you and I both
Mm-hmm.
do, is to be able to give people that. And if somebody is, you know, feeling like that the only way to do it is to be as frank and transparent as you are, that's how you heal from something like this. I wanted to make sure that some people know that that's not necessarily the case, but you do need to be able to, you know, is this something that you self-help your way through? You know, in your experience with this, I mean, you offer resources and services as a coach for people that are incest survivors. You know, this feels to me, and I'm not, you know, making a judgment, but it feels to me like this is such a severe violation that self-help is probably a great place to start, but ultimately not really the end game in terms
No.
of being able to improve your life and to be able to heal from this substantially, right?
I think this is a therapy situation, and it's a therapy situation. And even as a coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will not work with folks who have not been through therapy, because I believe that they have to get to a point where being able to be coached is different than being going through therapy. Because I don't take people back, and I really think that you need to go back and understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I focus on where are you today and what's happening.
Right, right. Now, do you actually, with your practice, do you actually work with men? Because I know, like I said, you know, you and I off camera before the episode actually started, and also this happens sometimes, is that when my show is me talking with another woman, you know, our filter, you know, kind of goes in, and we think that this is just a woman problem, and we're talking about father-daughter incest, which I believe they had said was like one of the largest reported forms of incest, but they actually
Mm-hmm.
think that maybe older sibling, younger sibling is maybe much more dominant. So men, you know, can be incest survivors or victims as
Absolutely.
well. And so do you work with several men as well?
So I have not worked with men. That's not to say that I wouldn't work with men, but
Mm-hmm.
I have not have men that approached me for that type of support. However, I do have a podcast. In that podcast, I have had a male survivor come on and talk. And when we talk about this, we're still not necessarily talking, opposite sex. This can be mother to daughter. This can be father to son. This can be brother to brother, sister to brother, brother to sister. It's a question of control and that disparity in age that is really the driving factors. So, yeah, it's not a gender specific thing. It's not another demographic specific thing. It happens everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So let's start to go into Tale of the Bell and the work that you do
Mm-hmm.
today with this, because it's obvious. Not only have you invested a lot of time in yourself, and your
Mm-hmm.
openness is inspiring here. How do you help other incest survivors? So for anybody that's actually listening to the show, or this show's been shared with somebody in there, you know, what is it that they get with working with you? Because you are a certified life coach. And you have, like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, an array of things that you're able to help people with.
Mm-hmm. So one of the biggest things as a survivor is the isolation that happens. It's the secrecy, it's the shame. And it wasn't until I was 46 years old when I met another incest survivor that I absolutely felt understood. I had been loved. I mean, I had an amazing marriage. I had, 4 children, 2 of which we adopted, and 2 of which were biological. And my husband was an extremely gentle, generous man um, who was very loving, empathetic. He was my rock. He was my safe place. But he never understood. And it took another incest survivor to understand, to truly get it and get me, that I didn't feel different. So when my husband died when I was 49 years old, my childhood demons came back after 20 years of being very much in a good place and thriving, really thriving, enjoying life, giving back. And in those moments, I literally was back having nightmares. I went back into therapy, and because I had lost my safe place. And once again, I had to learn that I kept myself safe. He was just my mirror. But that was something that I had to learn. Um, so in that regard, as I healed from that, the reality of what I found was 20 something years later, there were still no resources available to just talk. I mean, beyond therapy, there was no resources available. I went to a life after loss group for widows and widowers, and they were very helpful, but they didn't understand that I also had young children. My children were 14 years old when he died, so I had that dynamic. But he had also committed suicide, so I had a suicide dynamic in there,
Oh, wow.
and I'm an incest survivor. There's like no resources available at all to talk to someone who truly gets it. And so that's when I decided that if not me, who? And if not now, when? And enough is enough. So I waited until I had really kind of worked through my husband's death, that my children were okay. And 2 years ago, I went back into school and became a life coach, and really focusing on helping survivors in a sense of community, survivor to survivor, in group settings to the most part, but really to try and get to that level that somebody else gets this, that somebody else you can understand and get practical tips, that if you're having sex and you start dissociating, what are some things that you can do? That if you are, you're sitting with somebody you love, that you're in an intimate relationship with, and that they want to move on and have sex, and you're not quite ready, and you can't express that, what do you do? So practical tips are a big deal about what I kind of foster for, because it's like, think of it as talking to your best friend, but these are friends that understand
Yeah.
because they've been there.
Yeah, yeah. And I had made a comment earlier today. I was talking with somebody else too about the fact that, it really is important that when you are working through a lot of things in life and you're growing and you're investing in your time to grow and heal from a lot of stuff, to start to really take eye on who you're taking advice from, And so I have actually found like, I now limit my advice to come from people that are also working on their own stuff, because of that reason right there. We have a perspective. We know how to call ourselves out when we need to. We know how to have open conversations. We learn a lot about how to be reflective and not be critical of ourselves. I mean, it's an ongoing process, but definitely it's helpful for communities of understanding to be able to find each other, which is why, having you here and talking about this as you do, I don't poll my listeners. And like I said, there's probably several that haven't admitted or don't know, or they know somebody that may be struggling with their incest, history, and trying to find out how to be able to find somebody that can actually help them and guide them through that. And so I appreciate
Yeah.
that you do what you do. Like I said, at the beginning of this, 50 minutes ago, I can't even describe this grief I felt for little you. But definitely, the adult version of you, Nancy, is incredible. Like, I mean, just, this has
Thank
been,
you.
I've had more goosebumps in this interview than I've had like in the year and a half that I've been doing the show, because it's been
Wow.
inspiring to hear you and what you've done and how you've come through all of this, as devastating as it has been. And so thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. Now, I want to ask one last question though. For somebody who's sitting here listening to this show and they've been turning it off and on for, maybe a couple of hours because it's been gripping, what is really the first step? Somebody who's been holding on to a secret like this, that might be in their 50s, like you said, and they do want to do something and they don't want to take this any longer with them. What would you tell them to do? That would be step number one.
So I guess the first thing that I would say is there's nothing special about me. If I can, you can, right? There is hope, and that you're not alone. There's a lot more people out there than you would believe. So the first step I would say is look for a trauma-informed therapist, and they really need to be somebody trauma-informed. And when you're looking, don't settle for just anyone. And do some interviews. If you don't fit with that person, fire them. Go get someone else. You would do that with a contractor. This is much more important than that. So interview therapists. Most will give you for, 30 minutes or whatever free. And just talk about, this is what I want to talk about. This is what I need to discuss. Are you familiar with this? Can you help me? And if they don't feel right, move on. Because don't say don't do it. It's okay, because not everybody is right for the same person.
Right. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great advice. I tell everybody, it's like, it's okay to treat your therapist like a pair of shoes. It needs to fit. in order for it to do, because then you get a really meaningful relationship with somebody that you feel so much more comfortable with sharing some of the, some of the stuff that you have to go back in, because digging through your past is painful. It's not easy to do that, but you're becoming an archaeologist so that you can understand, what the future is moving forward. So,
Yeah.
well, Nancy,
The second thing that I would,
oh, go ahead.
before I move on, the second thing that I would say in here is make sure that you have support, because this is going to be very difficult. It is worthwhile doing. It is amazing when you move on to the other side, but you shouldn't have to go through this alone. So make sure you have support.
Okay, that's great. Awesome. Thank you. I want to thank you again for your time and your candor to do this, and taking the time, almost an hour out of your morning to talk to me about this. Everybody, I'm going to have links to her website in the podcast notes so that you can get to it, but it's taleofthebell.com. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, it's
And
TAIL, the tail end of the bell curve.
Right. Yeah. And she's got a really great description of where that name comes from. So if you want to hear the story, go check out the website and you can read about what she does. And you offer group sessions as well as individual coaching sessions. And so there's a variety of resources also on your website for people that are starting to explore, wanting to get all this healing. And so all the links to all that stuff will be in the podcast notes. And so thank you again, Nancy, for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Cool.